among representatives of all parties in the House. And I understand that there is agreement before we proceed with statements by ministers to now rise and observe a moment of silence in honor of the Right Honourable Brian Mulroney, the 18th Prime Minister of Canada.
Among representatives of all the parties in the House, and I understand there is agreement before we proceed with statements by ministers to now rise and observe a moment of silence in honour of the Right Honourable Brian Mulroney, the 18th Prime Minister of Canada. Je donne maintenant la parole au très honorable.
I now recognize the Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the night before this House last rose, Canadians received the news that one of the lions of Canadian politics had left us. Prime Minister Brian Mulroney served in this chamber for a decade, but he served Canada his entire life. He loved this country with his whole heart, and he knew we were capable of great things. He saw that the greatest strength of this country was our shared values: opportunity, fairness, and justice for all, was one of the ways he put it. But he also understood that success was not automatic. It took hard work. C'est grâce à son éthique de
Thanks to his work ethic, the son of a Bécomo, blue-collar worker, was able to lead a mining company and ultimately became the Prime Minister of our great country. He was a proud Quebecer, proudly bilingual, and he never forgot his roots. He would shake anyone's hand with the same level of enthusiasm, whether it was a housewife, a worker, or a monarch.
To be with Prime Minister Mulroney was at his alma mater, St. FX, last year. Brian and Mila took me on a tour of Mulroney Hall, a beautiful building that houses an Institute of Government in his name. We sat in a replica of the Prime Minister's Centre Bloc office, and I reminisced not just about my own years in that office, but about visiting my dad there. And that got us talking about families and the impact that this life has on them. And then, as we walked, we talked about wisdom that he and my dad both shared, that leadership fundamentally is about getting the big things right. No matter what your political stripe or your style, that's your job. À l'une des occasions où il a parlé au
When speaking at the funeral of an American president, he stated that many individuals with varied skills and strengths have led the country, and that there will be others to come. But one thing is certain. Historians will see that in the history of Canada, Brian Mulroney led with vision and determination. He accomplished many great things.
Legacy on apartheid, where he was unremitting in his commitment to end that institutionalized racism. And he leveraged Canada's position in the Commonwealth to lead efforts that helped free Nelson Mandela from his cell on Robben Island. Nous le voyons dans l'héritage.
We can see it in his legacy on the environment. He understood that governments are responsible for fighting the degradation of the environment, and he signed a historic agreement with the US on air quality to fight acid rain. With global partners, he negotiated the Montreal Protocol to close the hole in the ozone layer. These agreements were not just essential at the time. They have become models of environmental cooperation. At a time when the international community is facing the climate crisis.
Greatest legacies was forging a free trade agreement with our closest ally, the United States. Prime Minister Mulroney was astute and perceived even back in the 80s a rising tide of American protectionism. He had the wisdom to understand that the best way to fight back was to embrace our friends. He envisioned a free trade relationship, and in working to make this vision a reality, he became a lifelong friend of two American presidents. With the creation of NAFTA, Brian Mulroney established the largest free trade area in the world and raised the standard of living for hundreds of millions of people, benefiting Canadians in every corner of this country for decades. Mais Brian savait aussi.
Brian also knew that you could take nothing for granted. He would say that you had to work every single day and every next day. And in that spirit, he took part when NAFTA was threatened a few years ago. He played a dual role. He was an advisor for my cabinet and for me, and he also played a role as a defender of Canada among the international and US political elite.
But even more so to Canada, that Brian vouched to the American Republican class that they could trust this Liberal Prime Minister. And even given partisan political pressure here at home, he always knew that the most important thing was getting a good deal for Canada and for Canadians. In our many, many conversations during that difficult time, he was gracious, generous, insightful, and determined to see Canada come out on top. NAFTA was created as an act of hope. So too was its renegotiation. Hope not just in the continual economic progress of this country, but hope that those values that once held us together, opportunity and fairness for all, livelihood above gimmicks, country above politics, that those values could still be the thing. Politics is not an easy life. Last June, after he walked me around the exhibits that the Institute formed in his name, Brian gave a speech where he said, "I have learned over the years that history is unconcerned with the trivia and the trash of rumors and gossip floating around Parliament Hill. History is only concerned with the big-ticket items that have shaped the future of Canada." Prenons tous un moment.
Let us all take a moment to reflect on what we wish to accomplish here in this House. Let us recall how important it is to make good decisions regardless of the zeitgeist, decisions that will last and endure the test of time.
Office doesn't want to win. And Brian Mulroney knew how to win, and he certainly enjoyed it. And he knew as well as anyone that there would be attacks and criticisms that stung. Mila, Caroline, Ben, Mark, Nicholas, you saw it up close, and you know how hard it can be. But on the big things, you also know full well he wouldn't let himself succumb to temporary pressure. He was motivated by service. And those things, those big things, have stood the test of history, 4 decades and counting. Today, we all gather to remember him in this House, and this weekend, Canadians across the country will say goodbye. But this will not be the last week that Canadians will quote him, remember his example, and be inspired by his service. It is not just his booming baritone that will forever echo in this chamber, but his values and his leadership. Nous disons au revoir.
We are saying goodbye to the man, but not to his conviction to put country before politics, his conviction to create possibilities, and his confidence in the infinite possibility of Canada.
Brian Mulroney's principles helped shape this nation and the world for the better, and we will all continue that work. Merci beaucoup.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition. I rise today in the House to honour a son of Quebec and a great man from Canada.
About a year ago, my wife Anna and I were at a mechanic shop servicing our car about 30 minutes south of here, and as I went to pay, the mechanic said, "Oh, you're that Conservative leader. You know, Brian Mulroney is a family friend of mine." And I said, "Oh, really? How do you know Brian Mulroney?" And he said, "Well, my dad was a miner at the iron ore company. And when Brian was the president, he used to spend a lot of time with the guys on the ground and ask their opinions, hear their stories, and most of all, get tips on how they could be running a better business." This was the kind of down-to-earth spirit that he brought, but more importantly than that spirit and collegiality with the workers on the ground was his incredible memory. You see, when that miner passed away, decades later, Brian called the family. What is so incredible about that phone call is that in the interim period, Brian Mulroney fought 2 leadership races, won 2 majority governments, shook hands and spent time with presidents, kings, queens, and other prime ministers, negotiated free trade deals, watched the end of the Cold War, sent our troops into the Persian Gulf, and with all that passing through his mind, he still remembered the miner from the iron ore company. That is kindness. That is humility. And you know where I think it came from? I think in that miner, he saw his dad, an electrician from a working class small town in Quebec, d'une ville.
From a working class town in Quebec, Bécomo.
Irish working class upbringing taught him the value of work, family, neighborhood, loyalty, and merit. For me, this part of his legacy is personal. I was born to a teenage mother, incidentally, she was from a working class Irish family. She put me up for adoption to 2 school teachers. And I was just becoming aware that there was such a thing as Prime Minister when he had that job. And like millions of young people from similar backgrounds, we looked to him and said, if the Irish son of a working class electrician from a mill town can rise to become Prime Minister, then in this country, anyone from anywhere can do anything. He took his journey from a small town to big business, leading some of the great enterprises of Canada. Many of these jobs he had in his late 30s and early 40s. His first shot at politics came with a setback, but he would brush aside that setback with a second run for leadership, which he would win before he could take on the mighty Liberal machine in the forthcoming 1984 election. Before he could do that, he had to come to this place. And on his first day in the House, he squared off with the legendary Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, who teased him about parachuting from his corporate office in Montreal into a by-election win in rural Nova Scotia. If you'll allow me to quote the records, Mr. Speaker, the member from Central Nova has come a long way from that log cabin in Pictou County. I see he's put away his rumpled trousers and odd sweaters to be brought out again in the next election. But in the meantime, Madam Speaker, it is nice for us in this change to be able to bask in the glow of the benign smile of a man who sent such shivers of pleasure down the spines of the matrons all the way from Oyster Pond to Mushaboom. That's some good stuff. Then Mulroney had to rise and respond, and he said, I want you to know, Prime Minister, that during the summer, while you were otherwise occupied, there was a very pleasant summer for me. There was one untoward incident, and only one. The Liberal candidate in Central Nova persistently referred to a candidate from Quebec who didn't live in his riding and lived in a $1 million house rent-free. And I want you to know, Prime Minister, I defended you vigorously. And when he appeared in this chamber with that big smile and confident tone, I think it was enough to make anybody take a walk in the snow. Soon after the election, he would go on, soon after he would win a record majority government. And he inherited a desperate, divided country, with skyrocketing debt having caused double-digit inflation, unemployment, and interest rates. Government had attacked industries and thousands of jobs. People's lives were falling apart. The country was more divided than ever before, with rocketing separatism and Western alienation. Yet he set out to do his work. He shrunk government, cut red tape, ended the appalling National Energy Program, privatized 23 money-losing state enterprises that went on to succeed and grow in the private sector. And to put any debate to rest, successive governments refused to renationalize any of them, proving that he was right. My personal favorite, he brought in the inflation control target, which required the Bank of Canada to keep our money solid, ending the prior decade of money printing inflation that had destroyed the working class. This policy, this inflation target, came in 1991 and would succeed in giving us price stability and sound money for 2.5 decades that followed. Finally, he stared down fear-mongering and falsehoods to defend and secure the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, the most successful trade agreement the modern world had ever seen, with the most lucrative economy in the history of the planet. In fact, all of the trade access and more than we have today with the United States was secured in that agreement.
He inherited a desperate, divided country with public debt that had caused inflation, high unemployment, and increased interest rates. The government was attacking the private sector and had destroyed thousands of jobs. People's lives were falling apart, but he gave people hope. And yet, he set down to the difficult task of reducing the size of government, reducing red tape, ending the terrible National Energy Program, and he privatized 23 state companies. These companies succeeded in the private sector, and successive governments have not renationalized any of those businesses. And as such, they've recognized that he was right. And my favorite was his decision to put in place a requirement to keep inflation low, to give that mandate to the central bank, 2.2%. That ended the money printing that had destroyed the working class in the previous decade. He put that policy in place in 1991, and it's a policy that has been respected, or was respected, for the following 25 years. Finally, he stood up for the idea of free trade with the United States, with an agreement that has been the most successful of all free trade agreements in the world, with an extraordinary economy. His economic policies created a consensus of good common sense, of free markets, of free trade, of disciplined spending, of a solid currency, of strong defense, and of a meritocracy and not an aristocracy. A consensus which lasted another 30 years following his election in 1984.
That he put forward, the ones I've named, all of them were controversial. Some were even unpopular, and yet none of them were repealed by the subsequent Liberal government. He, in fact, started in 1984, after his election, a common sense consensus of free markets, free trade, disciplined spending, sound money, strong defense, meritocracy, and not aristocracy, a consensus that would endure for 30 years after his 1984 election, and one that we should restore. Il s'est battu pour la langue française.
He fought for the French language and for respect for Quebec, for provincial autonomy.
War neutrality, and instead sided firmly and unequivocally with freedom and against communism. He led the world in the fight against apartheid. Nelson Mandela would later tell this House of Commons, and I will quote, "I would also like to pay special tribute to the Prime Minister of this country, Brian Mulroney, who has continued along the path charted by Prime Minister Diefenbaker, who acted against apartheid because he knew that no person of conscience could stand aside as a crime against humanity was being committed. Prime Minister Mulroney, our people and organization respect and admire you as a true friend. We have been greatly strengthened by your involvement in the struggle against apartheid and the leadership that you have provided." He stood for the freedom at home as well. He stood on the side of turban-wearing Sikhs by allowing them to serve in the RCMP, where they keep us safe to this day. He was brilliant at talking through a microphone, but even better at talking through a telephone. In fact, for Brian Mulroney, phone calls were like an art form, using the telephone the way Michelangelo might have used a chisel or a brush. He would do it to make business deals, charm foreign leaders, and more importantly, to comfort grieving or suffering friends. I've lost count of the number of people who've told me about the worst day in their lives. They might have lost a loved one or a friend or suffered a terrible public humiliation. And then suddenly the phone would ring. And it would be that mellifluous baritone on the other end of the line. It's Brian Mulroney. He would console, joke, and maybe even throw in the odd curse about the unfairness of it all. And his friend's turmoil melted into the astonishment that one of the country's greatest prime ministers had offered love and laughter. I would call and seek his advice. In fact, I was very blessed to receive it. I asked him, for example, what is it that he did to deal with all the strain of the job, the anticipation of a close election, the worry about the fate of a political battle? His answer was not that he studied Stoicism or mastered yoga or meditated on a hilltop, or even that he was a tough guy that had no worries in the world. No, he explained to me very simple that he surmounted worry through one word: Mila. Mila Mulroney. His half-century-long love affair with Mila is one for the ages. They would have been married 52 years in just a short time. He credited her with all his victories. She was his closest advisor, his rock. Only days before he died, he embraced her, and even with his failing eyes, as she recounted to me the other day, he looked her straight in the face and said, "You are so beautiful." They were inseparable from the moment they met until he took his last breath. He would tell me that my wife, Anaida, who shared Mila's beautiful immigrant story, was my superpower. After my recent convention speech, he said, "My speech was terrific, but Anna's was far, far better." Clapping a little bit too loudly at that. Anna and I were happy to host the Mulroneys as our first guests at Stornoway after taking on these functions, and we were able to plunder both of their minds for incredible advice, which I will not reveal here because I do not want any of my political competitors to take advantage of them. But the best and most important advice was to stand with family. Brian and Mila's achievements are greatest when it comes to their kids, who tell stories even today that they could call Brian at any time, and he would take the calls even when he was Prime Minister. Later, they would find out that he had left world summits or cabinet meetings to talk with them. And that is why Mark, Caroline, Nicholas, and Ben have been such smashing successes in their own right. And they are now parents themselves, 16 grandchildren. Go forth and multiply indeed. And so he lived out the words of Kipling, which I will summarize and paraphrase. If you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you. If you can trust yourself when all men doubt you, but make allowance for their doubting too. If you can bear to hear the truth you've spoken, twisted by knaves to make a trap for fools. Or watch the things you gave your life to, broken, and stoop down and build them up with worn-out tools. If you can talk with crowds and keep your virtue, or walk with kings, nor lose your common touch. Yours is the earth and everything in it, and, which is more, you'll be a man, my son. Rest in the peace of God, Prime Minister Mulroney. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Bécancour, Nicolet Sorel. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have great memories of this Prime Minister. I was elected at the same time as he was on his team in 1984 on September 4th. He was a great Canadian and a great Quebecer, a great Prime Minister. On behalf of the Bloc Québécois, first of all, I offer my sincerest condolences to his wife Mila, his daughter Caroline, his sons Ben, Mark, and Nicholas, and his grandchildren. I remember Brian Mulroney as being, first and foremost, a family man. He loved Mila, his wife and lifelong companion. He was so proud of his children, and he cherished his role as a grandfather. He was never more than a phone call away from his family, and I know how much he loved spending time with his family. Born into a working-class family, Mr. Mulroney grew up on the north shore of Quebec in the paper-making town of Bécomo. He had an incredibly strong work ethic, and Mr. Mulroney rose to the highest echelons of the legal and business communities in Montreal in the 1970s, to the point that he even became CEO of a major corporation in his 30s. From an early age, he took particular interest in politics in Quebec and Canada. Driven by a deep desire to build a modern Quebec and a modern Canada, he threw himself into the political arena instead of standing by simply as an observer.
In 1984, Mr. Mulroney led the now defunct Progressive Conservative Party to the greatest election victory. This party no longer exists, but he led them to the greatest election victory in history. He immediately embarked on major reforms in the Canadian economy: NAFTA, privatization of state-owned companies, a policy of low inflation, deregulation, and spending cuts, and the introduction of the GST. This father of North American free trade, who would play a pivotal role in Quebec's economic vitality as a creative, exporting nation, would see unemployment fall from 12 to 6% in Quebec less than 2 years later. We remember his engaging personality, which played a pivotal role in strengthening the important relationship between Canada and the United States. How could we forget that it was in Quebec City on St. Patrick's Day, which many were celebrating yesterday, that bonds were strengthened when Mr. Mulroney received President Ronald Reagan at the Grand Théâtre. True to their Québécois and Irish origins, they were, of course, singing a song. Their friendship was built when these two heads of state launched into When Irish Eyes Are Smiling. Brian Mulroney persisted and won the NAFTA challenge. One anecdote on the opposition of the Premier of Ontario throughout these negotiations. They were vigorously opposed to NAFTA. They made endless speeches, and yet, during a 3-month caucus after the NAFTA signature took place, Mr. Mulroney presented himself before the caucus. He used to do a motivational speech before every caucus, which the Anglophones called a pep talk. And he showed the caucus, well, he opened up to page 6 or 7 of the review. They saw the photo of the Premier of Ontario, and there was a message. Thanks to free trade, we can now invest in Ontario. 3 months later. So Mr. Mulroney had a sense of humor and showed this and made no comments against the Premier of Ontario. He had a deep respect for his adversaries, but also had a very deep sense of humor. And when it came to the GST, yes, opposition was virulent. It came from everywhere, even within our own progressive conservative caucus. Some members even quit and decided to sit as independents. And I was sure that I would be reelected as an independent candidate by just saying the word GST. We felt that a lot of people were against that reform. But Brian Mulroney did not waver. He persisted. And he did implement the GST. And today, no one would want to change that. Exporting companies then used to pay a tax on the goods that they exported. And this was absolutely abnormal. And Brian Mulroney promised to end that. And he did do so. Let's not forget he was capable of reconciling an open economic approach and confidence in the markets, but also capable of world leadership in environmental matters. He signed a Canada-US treaty on acid rain, and he was behind the Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer. This made him the greenest prime minister ever. International relations he established, his negotiation skills, his continual desire for consensus enabled him to exert influence on the international stage. He was one of the first to react to the famine in Ethiopia in 1984. He led the campaign against apartheid in South Africa, being the first Commonwealth country to impose economic sanctions on that country, despite opposition from Margaret Thatcher and the American president at the time. His actions led to Nelson Mandela's release. And he was also very active and a leader in the International Organization of the Francophonie. In addition to the highest honors bestowed by Quebec and Canada, he received the highest distinctions from many countries, including France, where he was named Commander of the Legion of Honor. In South Africa, Supreme Companion of the O.R. Tambo. In Japan, Grand Cordon of the Order of the Rising Sun. In Haiti, Grand Cross of the National Order of Honor and Merit. And in Ukraine, Order of King Yaroslav the Wise. He was recognized internationally. There are elements of Brian Mulroney's political life that Quebec will always remember more than anyone else, and that too many have since forgotten or even swept under the carpet. He took it upon it himself to transform, almost single-handedly, the then historically difficult and distrustful relationship between Quebec and his party. And then, as the Prime Minister from 1984 to 1993, Quebecers will never forget that he was the last to make a sincere and ardent attempt to reconcile Quebec and Canada. Brian Mulroney had the courage to build his winning campaign of 1984 on respect for Quebecers and their pride. He won with the support of the most nationalistic amongst us, René Lévesque, who put his trust in him the day after the 1980 referendum. Lucien Bouchard placed his trust in him as well. And remember that the news of their recent reconciliation put a smile on the faces of many Quebecers. Most Quebecers put their trust in him. And I placed my trust in him when I was elected to this House alongside him in 1984. I was certain, like the majority of Quebecers, that he was able to lead with a steady hand and lead the government that would fulfill Quebec's aspirations. He promised himself and promised us that the deceit surrounding the patriation of the 1982 Constitution would not seal the future of relations between Quebecers and Canadians, that Quebec could take its place as a people within this Constitution and Federation with honor and enthusiasm, he said. He even used the term he took from John Turner during his first debate, that Quebec had an option. And this openness to Quebecers did not hurt Mr. Mulroney, quite the contrary. His nationalist commitment enabled him in his first election as leader to win no less than 211 of the then 282 seats, including 57 in Quebec. He was then re-elected with a majority in 1988. And this was the first time since Confederation that the Progressive Conservative Party won back-to-back majority elections. Every time on a promise that no federal party is expected to make in 2024, namely to reform Canada to include Quebec with dignity. Just a few kilometers from this house, on the shores of Meech Lake, he succeeded in convincing all the premiers of Canada's provinces to follow him in his gamble. He also convinced all the federal opposition leaders. They were all ready to recognize Quebec as a distinct nation. They were all ready to limit federal spending power. They were all ready to guarantee Quebec the right to opt out of federal programs with full compensation. Brian Mulroney loved Canada deeply, as much as he loved Quebec deeply, and this is why he did everything he could to make Quebec feel at home. He gave and tried everything to shape a better Canada, a true federation, united in mutual respect and celebration of its founding identities. What he tried, unfortunately, no one has tried since. During the years I had the honor and privilege of serving under him, I came into contact with a true statesman, a man of vision, who would stop at nothing to achieve the goals he set out for himself. A man who was affable, respectful of his opponents, and who had only one great objective, that is, to improve the lives of Quebecers and Canadians. My dear Brian, we had engraved your name on the trees on the hill, but time today has removed the bark. We had engraved your name on the sidewalk of the hill, but time today has broken the cement. But fortunately, we engraved your name in our hearts, and time will keep it there forever. Farewell, Prime Minister, and thank you.
The
Honourable Member for Burnaby South.
From Burnaby South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to offer my sincere condolences on behalf of all New Democrats to the family and friends of former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney. It's never easy to lose someone you love, and our thoughts are with you. To Canadians, he was a Prime Minister, but to those closest to him, he was a father, a grandfather, and a husband. I hope his loved ones can find some comfort in the many memories that people have shared about him as they grieve this loss. Prime Minister Mulroney will be remembered as someone who took big chances while he was in office. While there are a great many issues that, of course, he and I would not agree on, I want to acknowledge the legacy that he leaves behind after a long career of dedicated public service. I would be remiss not to point out that Mr. Mulroney was a progressive conservative. He respected our democracy and the role of the media in a way that wasn't remarkable at the time, but is no doubt noteworthy today.
He was also a great defender of human rights internationally. Brian Mulroney denounced loud and proud the injustices of apartheid in South Africa at a time when many world leaders remained silent. His firm position reminds us that we never should turn our backs to difficulties that people around the world are facing. And thousands of Canadians will always remember that Mr. Mulroney never ignored this flagrant violation of human rights. He decided to use his voice to help those who were suffering from apartheid, not for his own political gain, but because it was the right thing to do.
I also want to note Prime Minister Mulroney's environmental advocacy. He listened to the concerns raised by scientists about the hole in the ozone layer and the impacts it would have on Canadians, including higher rates of cancer. He responded to scientists' warning about acid rain and the damage it could have on our soil and our ability to grow food. Mr. Mulroney understood that if there wasn't responsible stewardship of our environment, Canadians' health would suffer. He understood that government played a significant role in ensuring people had clean water to drink and clean air to breathe for generations to come. In addition to his dedication to environmental advocacy, the former Prime Minister was also a champion for Quebec and Quebecers, as many have shared. Pour lui, c'était important.
For him, it was important for Quebecers to be recognized. He valued Quebec culture, heritage, and distinct society as an integral part of Canada. He defended Francophone linguistic rights, unlike Prime Ministers before him. Mr. Mulroney worked hard to build bridges between Anglophones and Francophones in Canada. He fought for Francophones to not feel like second-class citizens, but as an integral part of the social fabric of our country.
That the diversity of our country makes us a richer and stronger nation. At a time of more heightened divisions, where some political leaders try to score points by pitting one group of people against another, Mr. Mulroney will be remembered as someone who tried to build unity. Since he passed away, I heard a media interview with former Prime Minister Kim Campbell, his cabinet colleague and successor. The thing that really stands out is the way she spoke about his willingness to change his mind, to hear other points of view, and to adjust his actions. That Mr. Mulroney had this flexibility and open-mindedness is a testament to his leadership style and his character. And ultimately, Canadians expect this of their political leaders. There are bound, of course, to be disagreements between people with different life experiences and different perspectives, but truly listening and respecting one another should be a baseline for people in political life. And that's a standard that Mr. Mulroney upheld and exceeded. I want to share a story about the former Prime Minister that illustrates my point. Just a couple of months ago, our party lost a legend in our former leader, Ed Broadbent. His passing hit us hard, and it was, of course, a champion for disenfranchised people, a principled leader, and a wonderful friend. Even though at the time, Mr. Mulroney was in hospital dealing with his own health issues, he still made time to speak to media about his former political rival. He spoke of Ed from the hospital with tremendous respect and kindness. We could have just as easily decided not to do any interviews at all, and it would have been understandable. But that was so generous of him to honor an opponent. It says a lot about him as a leader and as a person. I want to close by reiterating my condolences to the former Prime Minister's loved ones and to thank them all for sharing him with this country. Merci. Thank you.
I see the honourable member from Saanich Gulf Islands rising in her place. Would this be in regard to seek the consent of the House to participate in the statements regarding the Right Honourable Brian Mulroney?
I humbly beg my friends to please let me join by unanimous consent of everyone here, because I love the former Prime Minister so much it's going to kill me if I don't get to say so out loud.
All those opposed to the honourable member moving the motion to speak will please say nay. Agreed. The House has heard the terms of the motion. All those opposed to the motion will please say nay. Carried. The honourable member from Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you. À toute la famille de...
To all of our former Prime Minister's family, Mila, Mark, Carolyn, my sincerest condolences.
Very huge honor and very unlikely event in the life of a very passionate non-conservative to serve as a member of the staff team for the Minister of Environment, and ultimately over the years to become a friend of Brian Mulroney. I've never said this to the family, but I used to have this recurring dream after I resigned from the office, and there was a certain amount of bad blood from the other Conservatives, never Brian Mulroney, about me leaving over my minister doing this little thing like breaking the law. And the thing about it was, I had this recurring dream that I kept running up to Brian Mulroney to say, I hope you know I love you. It was weird because I didn't know I felt that way when I was having this dream, but I had it over and over again. And then we got to be friends. And we became friends when I felt compelled as executive director of Sierra Club to write articles to say, look at this legacy, hello. And I was on the jury for who should be the greenest prime minister, and it wasn't close. This was in 2005. It wasn't like there were a lot of prime ministers who had that kind of record. So in thinking about my remarks today, I've decided there's no way I can actually speak to each of the accomplishments of the Mulroney government and of Brian Mulroney quite personally picking up the phone and putting the negotiations to stop the logging of Guayahanas, putting them back into play by calling Bill Vander Zalm and this was hard work and heavy lifting, and it was personal. Where it came from, I can't tell you, but I know it was profound and real and personal on issue after issue. So I've decided the only way I can get through them is to list them. I can hardly editorialize on the accomplishments because they are so many. But let's start with, under the category of under-promising and over-delivering, the multinational effort to deal with acid rain to actually solve the issue, to make every meeting with the President of the United States of America our single top bilateral issue was an environmental issue. It was acid rain every time. Then it was the ozone layer. We didn't just put in place some ideas. Brian Mulroney quite literally saved all life on Earth when Canada stood up and organized the Montreal Protocol and saved the ozone layer so that now just is no longer being eroded. It's repairing itself. And I was never so proud as to see him at the 30th anniversary of the Montreal Protocol in Montreal when he even mentioned me in his speech there. We were there in the same Congress where it was negotiated in September 1987. The Montreal Protocol is an astonishing accomplishment for this country, but it was Brian Mulroney personally who delivered it. It was the first international conference on the climate crisis in the last week of June 1988, which former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney opened and gave a speech that brought the House down and brought scientists from all around the world to their feet to cheer for what Stephen Schneider, one of the leading climate scientists, said, my God, this is our Woodstock. Prime ministers also, Gro Harlem Brundtland of Norway, opened that conference, the first one. But then the work kept going. The work to acknowledge and support the World Commission on Environment and Development and their landmark report, Our Common Future, to lead at the United Nations, to create the Earth Summit for June 1992, to lead with heavy lifting to deliver the Treaty for the Protection of Biological Diversity. And this is one of the hallmarks I was going to mention at the end. The things that Brian Mulroney did, not just standing up to his enemies, that's easy, standing up to his friends. So that when he saved the Biodiversity Convention, and he did quite personally save it, when George Bush tried to kill it, he was standing up to his friends. When he stood up to throw South Africa out of the Commonwealth, he had to stand up to his friend whom he loved, Maggie Thatcher, because it was wrong to ignore apartheid and let South Africa be a member of the Commonwealth family. He stood up against his friends, and he stood up to Ronald Reagan on acid rain, and he delivered an agreement between Canada and the US that actually ended the scourge of acid rain pollution in Canada. He banned lead in gasoline. He banned the herbicide that was carcinogenic, Alachlor. He brought in the environmental legislation we still have, and some of which has been tragically repealed. He brought in the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. He brought in the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act. He brought in Canada's only federal water policy, and he created new institutions, only some of which we still have. He brought in the National Roundtable on Environment and Economy. He created the International Institute for Sustainable Development. He created the post of Ambassador for the Environment. He did the early work that led to the creation of the Arctic Council. He brought in the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreements, multilateral agreements between many levels of governments, provinces, and federally. And he brought in the national parks, one after the other, Katitinarpak Park, which was then we called Ellesmere, creating that on Ellesmere Island. Guayahanas, we talked earlier today in the House of the news of what's been done for the Haida, with the Haida Nation and acknowledging their sovereignty. But for Brian Mulroney to fly to Vancouver Island to sign the deal with Premier Van der Zalm, and I'll never forget Pat Carney, another dear friend we lost this year, saying to all the men gathered there, you know, a lot of what you've done in your political careers will be forgotten, but this will last. This will always be remembered. Guayahanas National Park, Canada's Galapagos, personally saved by Brian Mulroney. Yes, all the Haida elders who blocked the logging roads and got arrested can't take the thing away from their courage. But the personal courage of the elders who blocked the logging road would have come to a historical footnote if Brian Mulroney hadn't been willing to get a deal and get Bill Van der Zalm back to the negotiating table. Grasslands National Park, Pacific Rim National Park, Georgian Bay National Park, the early work on the Rouge Valley. Making poverty history, the best international development funding record Canada has ever had, the closest we've ever come to the Pearson target, was under Brian Mulroney when we still had a Canadian International Development Agency. Our funding commitments under Brian Mulroney were the most generous of Canada's whole history in international development, stepping up to respond to the Ethiopian famine. The problem is with this kind of resume, not only can you not pad it, you can't even list it and not run out of time. How did he do all this? Well, he had skills and talents. Being Irish, I can only suspect he actually physically once kissed the Blarney Stone. There's no real way to explain how he could charm the birds out of the trees, but he sure as heck could. And he could make people laugh. I loved his jokes so much. I feel like that old joke where you could just give the punchlines and the family will know which ones were the best. But, you know, do you know who I am? I'm the man who gives out the butter. These were great jokes. They made the timing, his comic timing was perfect. But one thing about Brian Mulroney's humor, and he was great at it, there was never a joke at anyone's expense. There was never a cruel joke. And if there was ever a joke at someone's expense, it was his own self-deprecating humor at his own expense. Talking about the time back in 2005 when he missed the first award dinner for his being the greenest prime minister. And he talked about it later, about being in hospital, and some old guy who looked pretty rough looking at him and saying, "Did you used to be Brian Mulroney?" But he could make, at your lowest moments, he could make you laugh, and that's another thing that I just can't say enough, how grateful I am and how deeply honored I am, and there's no explaining the generosity and the kindness of his heart, that when I was having low moments now and then, I couldn't believe it when my office would say, former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney wants to talk to you on the phone. Are you kidding me? I'd love to tell you what he said, but it's so darn funny, but I really can't repeat it. Dear Brian Mulroney, there aren't any pearly gates anywhere near this place. Like a bat out of hell, one would say, but still, I know where there's a proper welcome and open arms and angelic choirs for someone who deserved and deserves to come home. God bless you and your family and your children and your grandchildren and all who loved you. You lived well and you loved this country. Let us continue to try to meet that example of a good-hearted, kind, spirited, generous, and brilliant Canadian.
Hear, hear.
Chers collègues,
Colleagues, thank you for those kind words and thoughts and the deep respect you've shown for our 18th Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Brian Mulroney. The history of his life is like a fairy tale. From his beginnings in Baie-Comeau to a leader who made Canada a better place, a leader in the world, an example of courage, vision, and love.
February 29, it was the last day of Black History Month. And that evening, I took a stage at a final Black History Month event and announced to those assembled the passing of the Right Honourable Gentleman. I reminded the crowd the great debt of gratitude that Black Canadians, indeed what Black people around the world and indeed any freedom-loving people owed Brian Mulroney for his work to end apartheid. For he was a fearless politician who fought for policies that frankly transformed the world. He never wavered from what he believed was right, no matter how hard or how controversial, from fighting apartheid in South Africa to apologizing for the wrongs committed against Japanese Canadians. Brian Mulroney's legacy puts him squarely on the side of justice. His charisma was legendary and made him a statesman like no other, and he was an amazing orator and a consummate network who could make magic happen by picking up the phone. Nous tous, dans cette...
All of us here in this place could learn from his kindness, his smile, and his civility. And all Canadians benefited from his intelligence, his hard work, and his outstanding dedication to public service.
His love for his beautiful family filled him with an infectious joy that grounded him with what matters most. And we are honored to have his family here with us today. As Canada grieves, we hope that the love and light that he brought to his family and friends and to all who knew him, as well as his indelible contributions to the people around the world and, of course, to our wonderful country, offer strength to his family during this time of sorrow. We will miss him. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
I wish to inform the House that because of the ministerial statement, government orders will be extended by 60 minutes. La Chambre va maintenant
The House will now proceed